from the UN. This is Nick Bjørnbak. He is the chief of the Peacekeeping Public Affairs section in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the UN headquarters here in New York. I was actually working in the former Yugoslavia at the same time as Nick. We never really met. We started both in 1996, where he was in Bosnia. Since then, he's been in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and probably a whole other host of places. He's now sort of the spokesperson for DPKO. And Nick, I understand that you will be speaking about peacekeeping operations and how well they help peace progress.
Thanks. Since I only have a short amount of time, I'm really just going to sort of tick off a couple of points that I wanted to make. This is fascinating for me because my day in general is entirely sort of operational, and peacekeeping's got 16 operations and 125,000 people in the field. So all day, every day, and before I was in peacekeeping, I was a military officer, and so that was very operational as well. And so everything that I do usually is force generation and how do you deal with this particular problem. And it's very rare that we get to sort of zoom back and think about sort of drivers of conflict as opposed to, yeah, that's fine, but how do you deal with the fact that they're coming over the hill now? And it's great, and it's really interesting for me to hear how this can be looked at from a sort of methodological perspective. A couple of things on that. Just to talk specifically about the study first, and then I'll get into my points. I think the peacekeeping contributions bit is a little tricky because there's, of course, what member states pay, their assessed contributions to the peacekeeping budget, and then there's what we pay them to contribute, and then there's sort of the knock-on effects of whether or not they're creating economic drivers in that area, right? So it's a bit like if there's a peacekeeper there. I mean, you made the point about Japan, that we sort of protect Japan. I mean, there are a number of peacekeeping operations where that same argument applies, where you can say, well, Congo's on this list, although I think Congo we should just have, it's an outlier. It's everything is wrapped up in the Democratic Republic of Congo to such an extent that you almost can't talk about it. There are parts of Congo that are doing really well right now economically and that are very stable. And then there are other parts of Congo that are some of the worst places in the world, right? So it's the size of a continent. It's almost hard to figure out where it is. But there are peacekeeping operations where there is that question. I mean, where would Haiti be post-earthquake if it wasn't for MINUSTA, right? And where would it have been post-2005? I mean, so it was comparatively stable, but it was stable because of a presence that was sort of bolted on top of it. So I think that question of how do you measure the contributions to peacekeeping, both in terms of the deployment and the other, is one that I would mention. One thing about peacekeeping and how it applies to this is that we tend to start below zero, which in looking at the list, I almost wonder if we belong on it at all. Because, like, for example, if you look at the bottom 10, numbers 140 through 149, in 2009, there was 1 out of 10 where there weren't United Nations peacekeeping presence, and that was a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia. But whether it's DRC, Chad, Georgia, Israel, Pakistan, Sudan, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Iraq, check, and check. So we really are kind of the court of last resort in a lot of ways, and so peacekeeping sort of fits in as when it gets so bad that there isn't anything else that you can do, it tends to sort of go to peacekeeping. My former boss used to say that peacekeeping is the last stop before hell, which is kind of dramatic, and I like saying it, but it's a bit much. Peacekeeping, the way peacekeeping used to deploy was very sort of military driven, and it was observation and monitoring driven. I get to this for a reason. That in the Cold War, when we deployed, we tended to deploy between parties that had basically agreed to a ceasefire but just didn't trust each other, and so they called on us to get in between. A series of really telegenic failures in the 1990s, Bosnia obviously being one, but former Yugoslavia being one, but Somalia and Rwanda, and I would argue Liberia, pushed the UN and United Nations peacekeeping to start thinking about these things more holistically. And these are themes that have been touched on before. And these are things like security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants. and building rule of law and security institutions, human rights monitoring, and perhaps the most important one, which is building sustainable institutions of governance. And for us, these are the sort of the things that you would need to measure. That violence, or the lack of peace, right, happens all the time in almost every place where the United Nations peacekeepers are deployed in these complex, multidimensional operations. But the question for us as to whether or not it's moving towards peace is, are those things happening? Are you building sustainable institutions of governance? Is it sustainable? Is rule of law and security institutions, are they being brought up, you know? That these things actually matter in some ways more than whether or not there are residual clashes going on. Yeah. Because most of the operations in which I've been deployed on, I mean, I started in Liberia before Bosnia and then Sierra Leone, both during wars. And, you know, when things got much better, there was still fighting all the time. But nobody who was there wouldn't have argued that it was, sorry about the double negative, everybody who was there would have argued that things were getting better, despite the fact that there were clashes. And that's the reality of, I think, of contemporary peacekeeping, that it is getting better. It's just that it still is messy and ragged, and I'm not quite sure how you reflect that reality in an index that takes into account all of these countries. It's really hard to sort of measure Japan in the same list as Congo. Mm-hmm. It just is, right? A couple of key factors that I want to just mention, and then I'll start to wrap. The first is that I don't know how you measure political will, but it's the single most important contributing factor to the success of the United Nations peacekeeping operation. That not every animal is equal, right? And some missions are sexier than others. And the fact is you know, in Kosovo we had 50,000 NATO troops, and Kosovo's the size of this room, right? You know, all right, well, it's a little bit bigger, but it's really small. And you know, we had 2 divisions of NATO troops there, plus every air asset in the world, the American 7th Fleet, all this stuff, right? And there were still acts of violence, and churches still got burned, and there were still, you know, people getting killed, and we were unable to stop it. Congo, which I swore I wouldn't mention, I'm now going to mention, Congo has 10,000 troops in the 2 Kivus and the Ituri district. It's the size of the Benelux countries. How exactly do you expect them to be able to see everything that's going on? No less see what's going on 20 kilometers away from one of their bases where people are being systematically raped. Political will. The resource dimension, which somebody mentioned as well, that whether or not there is something there that others want, both in a positive sense and a negative sense, is something that I think is a major driver. Who are your neighbors? The regional context. That in some places, you know, the role that Australia played in Timor in terms of stabilizing Timor was undoubtedly positive, and there are other examples like that, and there are examples that are negative as well, where their neighbors play very insidious roles. I'm thinking of Congo again. I think that, just going quickly now, that in terms of peace, that that there's a question of whether or not something is considered stable, but there is widespread coercion there. So it may not be that I know that the indicators get into some of this, but there are places that are listed as stable where the sort of your day-to-day experience of living there is not one that you would define as peaceful. Right? That is, in fact, that the day-to-day experience of a citizen there is one that's much more conditioned by being afraid of a government rather than having the freedoms of it. And then the last thing that I'll say is just on elections, because it was mentioned. I kind of come down on both sides on elections, and it's probably a product of my personal experience. That my first mission was in Liberia, and our role after we got evacuated and then went back in, our role was basically to facilitate the election of Charles Jupani Gange MacArthur Taylor as president of Liberia. So from a normative perspective, like, is that a desired end state? That you want a mass murdering cannibal as a duly democratic elected president of Liberia? I'd argue that the answer to that's probably no. Probably. So in that case, there's this a liberal democracy problem. Like, here you are, and he was elected. It was free and fair. But is that what you want? So, okay, elections not so great. And then I was in Timor in '99, and everybody who was there, 85% of the population voted, right? Everybody who voted in that election knew what was going to happen next. They showed up at the voting place with their suitcases because they knew what was coming, right? And they all voted. And so, and that's the miracle of the elections, that no matter how totalitarian the state is, no matter how much pressure they bring to bear, people will still exercise their franchise. And that's a remarkable thing. It's one of the most powerful tools the international community has at its disposal. And trying to figure out ways to square that circle is something that I think is important for peace, but I'm not quite sure how you measure it. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick. Let me just see. There was one point I think from also student presentations that I thought it would be good if you could also just think about, and that was from the International Law Group. They did suggest that GPI may be a good tool for early warning, sort of to point out where the hot zones are. I know that maybe the early warning days, the hot days of early warning have maybe passed now, but maybe you can think about that, whether this is something that would work.